Greetings. There are two presenters. One is Kara McBride. She's with World Learning, a specialist out of Washington, D.C. She works with me. My name is Jody Cripps. This is my sign name. I work at Clemson University, located in Clemson, South Carolina. We're going to be talking about sign languages and performing arts, both then and now. I'm going to touch on three things to give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about. The authenticity of sign languages and literature. We'll take a little time to discuss that and its history. Second, signed music. This is a new field that's emerged just in recent years. We're going to talk about that. And then three, the changing perspectives of sign language and the acceptance of sign languages in various societies throughout the world. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little about just a brief history of sign language performing arts and how it's placed in history. And sign language has a strong tradition of folklore. From its emergence until now, people know and have known about sign languages for many years, but the recognition about sign language has more to do with Lepay, who was a minister, a priest in France, and his goal was to teach deaf children and involved signs in doing so, and began to use it in public schools throughout Paris, France. We'll talk more later about that. Next, Gallaudet, Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, and Laurent Clerc. The two of them, how they met and began the process in America. First they met in Europe and then brought sign language to America and began teaching deaf children here in America moving forward. I'm going to share that story. And then next, number three, this story has been circulated for many years. It's called the Hitchhiker Story. The National Association of the Deaf, back in the day, was fighting against laws being established not allowing deaf people to drive. We're speaking of the 20s, the 1920s and 30s. It was forbidden for deaf people to drive, so they fought allowing deaf people to drive. But this story has been circulated and passed down for many years. You see the man standing in this picture. His name is Abbé de la Paix. He is a true legend, has been passed down through the years. And it talks about how he incorporated sign language into deaf ed. Back in the day, he was walking through the streets and saw two deaf sisters signing. And that got him to thinking, how can we teach deaf children using sign language? Now, the language they used was not the native French sign language. It is a methodical sign, meaning they borrowed from French spoken language, their grammar and structure, and incorporated that with signs, and began teaching and established the first public school for the deaf in Paris, France. And deaf people remembered that story and have passed that along for years. Well, he passed away, and from that point on, the deaf community celebrated LePay's story with an annual banquet. And now they do that in America. Last year, I attended a banquet in his honor, and they gave the brief story about his founding of the Schools for the Deaf and Sign Language, and they pass along. And then we had a nice dinner and a nice chat with the folks who attended. Now you see the two gentlemen here. First one, Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, and the second one, Laurent Claire. Laurent Claire is deaf. Gallaudet was hearing. And the story has it that the two of them met and brought to America sign language. I'm going to speak briefly about that. Gallaudet decided, after he had met a young girl, a deaf child who had no language, her father truly wanted her to be educated, wanted her to be taught, didn't know how to do it. So Gallaudet met with him and some other people. They pulled together some money, and he went to Europe and England to study how they educated the deaf. He wasn't really satisfied with what he saw, but there was an exhibition there. And Laurent Claire was part of that exhibition along with Massou, another deaf instructor. They were both teachers of the deaf, and one other person, their supervisor, by the name of Sicard. And Sicard was the one who planned these exhibitions and showed people how the deaf could learn through sign language to read and write. So Gallaudet decided to go and train in Paris, but ran out of time, had to return to America, but asked Laurent Claire to join him, which was very difficult for Claire. But the two of them left on a boat, the Mary Augusta, and sailed back to America back in 1816. So as they sailed back to America, during their time, their days, they exchanged information. Gallaudet taught Claire how to read and write English. He was French. And then Claire taught Gallaudet the French Sign Language. So the two of them shared this information, a collaborative arrangement. Back in 1816, they arrived in New York, made their way to Hartford, Connecticut, and there established in 1817 First School for the Deaf, and began doing exhibitions as they did in London, England. So they did the same thing here in America and began establishing other schools for the deaf. So people remember them for what they did, what they accomplished. And now the Hitchhiker Story. I mentioned this earlier. You remember the laws forbidding deaf people to drive. Of course, they never did ban them from driving, but this story is quite humorous. There are various versions, but they're almost all the same. You must have a hitchhiker, a patrolman, a car, a deaf and a hearing person. That's pretty consistent throughout the stories. But anyway, this is my little version of the Hitchhiker Story. Here's what happened. A deaf person's driving down the highway, and he sees a hitchhiker. So he pulls over, gestures for him to come in, to ride with him. He says, well, I can't hear. So the hitchhiker said, oh, you're deaf. But anyway, he jumps in the car, and the two of them drive down the interstate. As they're driving along, a policeman, a patrolman, pulls them over. The deaf person gestures and says, hey, don't say anything, no worries, I can take care of this. So he was surprised about this, but the patrolman walks up to his window, begins speaking to him. Deaf person rolls down the window and says, I can't hear, gestures that to him. Patrolman says, oh, you can't hear? Then he gestures to him, well, slow down, slow down. And the driver says, okay, I'll slow down. And then he waves him on. So he drives ahead, and after a few minutes, he's tired, and asks the hearing person to switch seats with him, allows him to drive. So they switch, and the hearing person begins driving. And of course, he begins to speed. The deaf person falls asleep, and another highway patrolman pulls him over. But the hearing person says, the hitchhiker remembers what the deaf person did, so he didn't think anything about it. And the patrolman walks up, and he says, hey, and the hitchhiker rolls down his window and says, oh, I can't hear. He gestures that to the patrolman. He says, oh, you can't hear? And he says, well, my parents are deaf, and they sign. You've been speeding. And the hitchhiker, of course, panics. He wakes up the deaf person and says, hey, this patrolman is signing. I don't know what to do. So this is the story, a humorous story that's been told over the years. The patrolman could sign because his parents were deaf. And this has been passed on for many, many years. Now, I'd like to talk about the recognition for Asl Literature, which has its own canon, videotapes, formal signs, film, various mediums. First, a really important film about the preservation of sign language from a man by the name of Viditz. His sign name is a bent V on the chin. He is from the Baltimore area, where he grew up and lived. He entered Gallaudet University, graduated, and then became the NAD president of the National Association of the Deaf. And at that time, from 1913 to 15, there were concerns that speech and oralism was beginning to negatively impact American Sign Language. So they produced various films. There were 15 or 16 different films, but one in particular was his. How we could preserve sign language from its destruction. Back in those days, society did not support sign language. So this was his response to that concern. Second, My Third Eye is from the National Theater of the Deaf. This was produced in the 1960s and 70s. The film was produced in 1973. And the point was, deaf people can think, they can sign, they can perform, create, involve in the arts, and establish a theater for the deaf with deaf actors. This was something quite novel for that day and time, that deaf people can do things, can be involved in the arts. And then next is a collection of over, 500 different stories. I'm sure there are more now. There are various genres. We'll talk about that later. How ASL has literature, genres, rules, etc. The man standing here is George Viditz. He's going to tell the story back in 1913, and it's a powerful, powerful message explaining how sign language must be preserved. And he considered sign language to be the noblest gift from God for the deaf people, a true blessing where they can sign and express themselves. So here's a short clip. Enjoy. This beautiful film of him signing how to preserve American Sign Language and how it's our responsibility. We can preserve our beautiful signs in its purest form. I hope we all will love and preserve our beautiful sign language. Is the noblest gift from God given to the deaf. My third eye you see here, I've talked about briefly. A little background of this particular performance. They have various skits. One in particular is sort of a reversal of roles. How deaf people may never have seen hearing people, and they stare and gawk. They use their mouths. Their lips move up and down. They have no expressions. They use a phone. What is that thing? They speak into this contraption? What is that? It's just a reversal of roles. Since hearing people for years have looked at deaf people as being odd and different and gawked, and this particular skit was called Sideshow. This skit that you're going to watch is related to a helicopter, a performance, and really it has music, a great deal of movement with a number of people. It has rhythm. It's a beautiful, creative skit back in the 1970s and involves a helicopter, a rescue, and a person who's drowning in the ocean. So it's a beautiful scenario of how you can incorporate signs into theater. So here we go. Here's the ocean, a lighthouse in the distance, an aircraft carrier just launched an airplane, another plane shooting at it, a gunboat that shoots it, hits it, and now the pilot has parachuted out of the plane into the ocean. And here's the helicopter flying above. They lower the basket. The pilot climbs into the basket, and they raise him into the helicopter. And the helicopter then flies off into the distance. Just in time, because a huge storm rolls in with lightning and thunder and heavy rains and wind and rolling waves in the ocean. And as it passes through and diminishes, we now see the sun. So now I'd like to talk about Asl Literature and Genres. Byrne published this in 2017 as part of his dissertation. This was his strong suit, American Sign Language Literature, and published a very nice illustration. First, we have folklore, stories that are passed along generation to generation, and a new area called single-authored. This is a new version of how people who are gaining notoriety as storytellers, actors, or poets, various folks who are getting fame for their work and gaining recognition. This began back in the 1990s, thereabouts, moving forward. Before then, not so much. So you see the listing we have. Under folklore, we have legends, tall tales, riddles, humor. Under single author, we have poetry, we have rhymes, epics. Under drama, you have comedy, historical, and then monologues. And under prose, you have a variety of narratives, personal experiences that deaf people strongly relate to. We have science fiction. It's quite rare, but we do have some. fiction, nonfiction, humor, allegories, and riddles. So that in a nutshell is what we have here, that American Sign Language does have literature, and it's not something contrived. Now, we've seen recently the emergence of signed music. The deaf community, and my work included, deaf people have had a lot of confusion, a lot of misunderstandings about deaf music and what that means. Can deaf people produce music? Deaf people wonder, you mean I can make music? No, I copy hearing people. I do what they do. I hear the beat, the sound, and then I translate what they have written, what they have produced. But as we analyze and look at it, we have discovered deaf people have their own music called signed music. They've created their own. They have not copied hearing music. It has its own rhythm, its own beat, its own elements of music. Since deaf music hasn't been recognized, we're just beginning to see and recognize, oh yes, there's music. There's some confusion about poetry. Is it one or the other? We just need to analyze this further. But for me, I can recognize it. Is it a poem or whether or not it's music? Sometimes it's blended or mixed. And now we have more and more performers since 2000. We had some up until that point, but we've seen a great deal more since the year 2000. More imagination, more creativity, more movement, more expression. Far more today within the deaf community. You might wonder, how did I get started? How did I get into music for the deaf? I'm not a musician, but I'm fascinated with the field. I started studying it. Didn't grow up with it. My sister is a performer. She did this eyes. I'm going to show you this clip in just a minute, but she began to explain to me, I'm deaf. My parents are deaf. She is hard of hearing. She began to show me what signed music looks like. She used to translate hearing music, but it didn't really interest me. But this really struck me. There's no translation, no lyrics. It just shows what sound looks like in a visual medium. And it's called non-lyrics. There are no words, no signs related to lyrics. It's just the movement of the hands. Take a look. Well, hope you enjoyed that. Now, the second clip is called TikTok by Ian Sanborn. Ian decided to produce a video that's music, has lyrics and non-lyrics. you'll see him do this with his hand. It means time is passing. There are no words. It's non-lyrics. And it has to do with a speech therapist and the time passing with speech therapy as it goes back and forth between lyrics and non-lyrics. But really, it is a powerful, powerful video that's influenced deaf people all over. They enjoy it so much. Why? Because they were all involved in speech language therapy. Deaf people all grow up being trained or brainwashed that they must learn to speak. And this is his response. It's quite a powerful, powerful response. I can say that most all deaf people experience speech therapy. Take a look. Hope you enjoy this. Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Gears of a clock, tick tock, tick tock. Minute hand, tick tock, tick tock. Time for speech, tick tock, tick tock. 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Minute hand passing, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. In walks one student, then another. Now we're all seated. Now it's time. Speech begins. Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Everyone's looking, everyone's speaking. The brainwashing begins. As we look back, the speech therapist, bow tie, glasses, paper and pencil, checking our speech. Is it correct? Tick tock. Say it. Enunciate. The brainwashing. Tick tock. Again. Enunciate. Again, again, again. We're all looking, all in unison, all speaking, all trying to emulate this therapist. Very good. Check. So now, society and sign language, how do we bring them together? This is so important for us to take a look at. How do we proceed and develop and improve life for deaf people, for those who are signers? The experiences they involve with society. There truly hasn't been enough. You'll notice 3 books here. You might be wondering, what's this about? Well, it wasn't long ago that they published these books and sign language was recognized as a language. Linguists took a look and realized, back in the 60s, a man by the name of William Stokey, he was a hearing professor at Gallaudet. He didn't sign so well. He wanted to sign, but as he studied it, he noticed ASL was a far more fluent language. And as he analyzed it, he realized it had its own language, its own grammar. So he wrote this book in 1965, published it, a dictionary. The second book is a linguistics book on American Sign Language, written by several people, Gallaudet professors, all of them Gallaudet professors. They published this book. Clayton Valley, a deaf gentleman, one of the authors. The others were hearing, but he wrote this book and was the first step towards people recognizing that ASL is a language. And the next book is Asl Poetry, written by the same gentleman, Valley. And the focus was poetry, Asl Poetry. And his work was done with young children, cute little poems, as well as poetry for adults, and how to teach them. These books helped to recognize that sign language was truly a language, and that spoken language has its own rules and syntax, and to try to mix the two is just inappropriate. You must keep them separate. They have some similarities, but they also have differences. Language is so critical. So I've included this little clip for you to watch. You can watch the full clip if you like. but explains the importance of ASL to parents and for deaf children to acquire language and learning and to avoid the delays. The actors here are from California State University at Northridge. They're the ones who produced this film. It's a cute little clip, some good acting, a short film. Here we go. Delicious. Water. Are you ready to play in the water? Huh? Red. Oh, red. You see, it's a nice way to have language involvement used in American Sign Language. Now let's look at sign language for linguistic accessibility, which is so critical for deaf children because deaf children need to have metalinguistic awareness acquired in preparation to access a reading writing program. How do they access it? There's an ASL Gloss program that I'm involved with, a reading program. We're not going to talk in depth about it, but the basic idea is that deaf people think in ASL and have to read and write in ASL. They tend to write in ASL. But when you compare it to the English text, it allows them to see and understand how the two differ, that they are actually two different languages. Oftentimes, and for many years, deaf people have written, and rather than writing English, they write as they think in ASL, and don't realize that they're two separate languages. Harmon found deaf students in college English wrote in ASL. And they have to go back. We need to go back and teach children that they're not the same, that they're two separate languages, and this reading program helps with that. You see this framework here. This is related to the Gloss reading program, how ASL literature is used with sign language, and also a writing language and a spoken language, and teaching them as such. L1, this is the first language, L2, second language. L1 is the American Sign Language, the signer, K through 12, and involves literature throughout the curriculum, and teaching it never stops. L2 is English learning. That's here in America. It may be different in other countries, but here in America, they learn to read and write English, and they have to have a special gloss approach to learn that process and transfer those thoughts, ASL thoughts, into English. And that begins at the 4th grade throughout. Using literature to do that, to help them to understand, to separate American Sign Language from English. Nursery rhymes are also used. I'll show you that in just a moment. how Asl Literature has nursery rhymes and transfers that to the writing language and begins that process of transferring from ASL to English. This lady's a beautiful signer. It's called The Fall. And she's going to show you hand shapes, location, and movement, the beautiful array of signs and poetry involved in playing with this nursery rhyme. We'll show you in a bit this little clip and get an idea of how that can apply to the classroom and learning for children. Here are the trees, and the leaves fall. We rake the leaves, and the mound of leaves grows. And then come the winds, and then we wrap a scarf to stay warm. So you just saw an ASL poem, and now we're going to see signed music, and you'll see the difference. There's a rhythm, a consistent beat, a back and forth between the two boats, and she created this song with these signs. It's not something she copied, not something she's translated. It's music to the eyes, so enjoy the song. It's called The River Song. The sun rises into the sky. Its rays glisten on the rushing water as it goes down the river. There's a small hand-hewn wooden boat on one side, and then a larger shiny boat on the other side. They look at one another as the water rushes past them, and off they go, racing, cutting through the water down the river. They look at one another. They share the lead, the smaller boat keeping pace, the larger vessel very confident. The larger vessel pulls away, the smaller boat desperately keeping pace. Ups, and then it capsizes. The larger vessel looks and scoffs. The smaller boat sheds a tear. The larger vessel continues its trip down the river as the trees pass by. So, I've shown you an ASL rhyme and then signed music, two cute ways to share with children before or after they enter school. It doesn't really matter. A nice way and idea to use with young children. And this relates to an Ontario, Canada group, people who developed some videos called Parent-Child Interaction, ASL Mother Goose program. They involve parents how to teach children. Many of the parents are hearing, don't really know how to sign, they're learning to sign, but they have a deaf mentor who works with them and teaches them and shows them how to sign so that their children can acquire nursery rhymes in ASL. We'll share this little clip with you. If you'd like to watch the full clip some other time, you can do so. Take a look. Here, they're sharing a butterfly. And now a goose. And you see a fish. And he catches the fish and swallows it. Well, you see, what a nice way for parents to interact with their child. Now, how do we get society involved? How can we accomplish this? The widespread use of sign language in society is so important. It means hearing people begin to learn ASL, or a signed language, or whatever country or their particular sign language is, so that you can be ready to converse with a deaf person. One special situation there in New Zealand, they have recognized New Zealand Sign Language as an official language. They have 3 official languages there. First is English, second is Maori, and third, New Zealand Sign Language. The fact that they've established it officially is so important. It means that they've infused it throughout the country because it's been recognized. Just to give you one example, they've involved New Zealand Sign Language in their curriculum for children. Children going to school have access and the right to learn sign language. They have ways of teaching, but for deaf children, they still need a special reading program to mesh with what they're doing with hearing children and embed it with the curriculum they have. It's still a work in progress. It's not perfect, but the idea is powerful and it's spreading. You see this gentleman every day. He signs phrases for free, and people can learn and perhaps converse with deaf people. That's really nice. What a nice idea. I hope this will spread into the future, that people will be able to learn, and I can converse and chat with people rather than finding an interpreter to talk with them. Interpreters are important for certain situations, but for everyday conversation, not so much. You can learn to sign with deaf people. So here's a gentleman teaching signs each and every day. Well, I've shared with you the history of sign language and performing arts passed through the years, the emergence of new concepts like sign music, how exciting that is, and then now, society. The importance that we continue spreading, sharing this information about American Sign Language. It has principles, linguistic principles. We have literature. We have music in signs now. This, in a nutshell, is so critical for the intrinsic value of deaf children, deaf adults, and deaf people in general. Those who are signers are looking to be more involved, to have a relationship with society. And hopefully society will consider the needs of deaf people and include them, whether it's information, language learning. There are just so many aspects of life that it hits upon, that it involves in. The spread of ASL is so critical, whether it's here or in other countries. Hopefully, the future will see the emergence of this relationship if we will just work together. Thank you.